Hello and welcome to this recording of an In Conversation held at CCA Derry Londonderry between artist Christopher Steenson and archaeologist and historian Brian Lacey. I'm Catherine Hemelryk, CCA's director, and this was recorded in the gallery with a live audience during the opening weekend of Christopher's new solo show, All I See Is the Present. It was recorded purposefully at Midsummer, June 2026, as a yearning nod to one of the key inspirations of the exhibition, the Baymore stone circles and alignments in County Tyrone, a place where, as we will hear, researchers have tried to understand and make celestial links for many years. This exhibition combines sound, photography, installation, and archival material to explore the ways in which moments from prehistory can be used as a gateway to the present. It is the first manifestation of Christopher's long-term engagement with research exploring the prehistoric past of the island of Ireland. And around us, as we recorded, in the somewhat echoey Gallery 3, were slides from Christopher's research, as well as artefacts from National Museum's NI collections from Baymore, including stone axe heads that are over 6,000 years old. Christopher Steenson's work bridges historical and speculative narratives to interrogate the politics of time, environment, and more than human relations. In approaching these concerns, he seeks to make work that we can listen across tenses. Recent solo exhibitions include They Haven't Got Away, You Know, at Mother's Tankstation in Dublin, 2025, Breath Variations, Flat Time House in London, 2023, and Soft Rains Will Come, Visual Carlow, 2022. Brian Lacey is an archaeologist and historian, former university lecturer, museum director, and the head of the Discovery Programme, Archaeological Research Institution. He's the author of about 15 books and many research papers, and his latest book, Cenil Nugan and the Donegal Kingdoms, is available from all good bookshops. This recording is supported by Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council, Garfield Weston Foundation, the Elephant Trust, Arts Council Ireland, Northern Ireland Screen Digital Film Archive, and the event was part of Heritage Month across Derry City and Strabane District. Now, let's join the conversation. So, over to our speakers, and I'd like to start by inviting Brian to ask the initial question you started asking in the office earlier, and I went, no, pause, let's have this conversation with our audience.
Okay, well, listen, thanks very much, Catherine, for inviting me. It's Christopher's to blame for everything that follows. This is kind of a very interesting position for me to be in. I actually once did something like this here in Derry years ago, back in the old Orchard Gallery. And I can't remember the artist, but he was a photographer as well. But he was interested in ancient monuments, and we had some sort of collaboration. So this is kind of very interesting to see a different take on the sort of stuff that I deal with almost every day in my life. But when you came in, I had never met Christopher before, and we were to have a sort of a Zoom or conversations, but anyway, the technology didn't work. So I had never met him until about an hour ago or something like that.
We met on the radio, which is...
met on the radio. But when he came in, I thought to just position myself, I said to him, are you an artist or an archaeologist or some combination of both?
Yeah.
And then like to answer that question.
Well, I think I would like to be an archaeologist. Yeah, I think I've always I think it would be very cool to be for my biography to be like Christopher Steenson is an artist and an archaeologist. You know, that would be impressive. But I'm not an archaeologist.
A lot of archaeologists were spies. There's a connection to espionage.
So no, I'm not an archaeologist. I would really like to be. I've been increasingly interested in archaeology over the past probably 3 or 4 years. Starting maybe like 2023 is when I really got the bug, but started maybe a little bit earlier. Probably started reading a book that came out in I think 2021. It was called The Dawn of Everything, and it was a book by David Wengrow and David Graeber. David Graeber was an anthropologist and David Wengrow was an archaeologist, and they wrote this book sort of talking about the origins of inequality and where that idea came from, like talking about Rousseau and his idea that inequality started with agriculture. But like they reinterrogate the material and start talking about, how Rousseau never really said that, but people took him up as saying that, but he was really only ever saying that in a speculative fashion. Just like, imagine if they were to say this, and then we went off from there. I thought that book was really interesting, and they take lots of different pieces of archaeological evidence and sort of put forward the case that there can be different ways of living in the world that aren't the way we live now. We can reform power structures and ways of living that don't necessarily end in like authoritarian government and capitalism and the kinds of ways the world seems to be sort of swaying towards now, that there are other ways of going about things. And that got me really interested. And I guess just like naturally enough, you start to notice that there's just like loads of archaeology in Ireland, amazing archaeology that's still intact. You have all these like tombs and ring forts, and it's just like, you know, you literally can like walk outside your door and trip over something, and it's like
literally outside this door.
Well, like that outside this door, exactly, you know. So it felt like really natural to then just try and engage with that in some kind of way, and to start thinking about how I could maybe use those ideas that Graeber and Wengo were talking about in that book, and to start incorporating that into my practice in some kind of way as an artist. But yeah, to answer your question, so yeah, I guess like an armchair archaeologist in that kind of way, where like I'm really interested in archaeological theory and reading around archaeology and then trying to think about that in artistic terms, which is quite natural. There's loads of like overlaps, theoretical overlaps in archaeology. There's, you know, like Marxist archaeology, there's feminist archaeology, there's archaeology that's really into like Deleuze and Guattari, like, which is like really big in like art college theory. There's lots of like nice overlaps that allow you to just start to think about how you can incorporate that into an art practice.
One of the, I suppose, again, I didn't see this exhibition about 2 hours ago. I suppose the thing that struck me immediately is, I wonder if it touches at any rate, if it's not about, it touches on the Troubles.
Yeah.
And it also touches on prehistoric Ireland. I think they're two totally different ideas, which you wouldn't imagine coming together in any way. But you've actually brought them together in a very interesting fashion. And do you want to say something about that? Or?
I guess that's something that I've been doing with the work, interrogating that recent history, you know, and I guess with this research, it's sort of, I didn't really intend it to go that way for this. I thought I wanted it to maybe to be something else, this show to be something else, but I became interested in being more this stone circle, this site in Tyrone, which is like a series of stone circles and alignments, partially because it's in Tyrone and I'm from Tyrone originally, and I just thought that it would be interesting to sort of research a site that, you know, close to where I'm from.
Yeah.
And then I went to Hironi into the archives where there's
Hironi is
the historic environment records office.
Okay, yeah.
I think is the name, but I can never really remember how the acronym was.
We used to know it as the Historic Monuments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's sort of interesting. Well, it's the archaeological survey before all of that, and it was that period around the archaeological survey under this person Pat Collins, where I was really interested in that period. And there was a moment in the archive that I uncovered where Pat Collins was really interested in being more and was trying to understand the astronomical function of that site, because there are all these alignments. I think he wanted to really like pin down why were those alignments there, were they aligned to something, some kind of event or part of the landscape, were these monuments pointing towards something in the sky or whatever.
And were they?
And were they? Yeah. Well, the answer to that is nobody really knows for sure still, but like they definitely have like it's a northeast orientation, which
so it's rising sun.
Probably. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But there's nothing like strong to suggest that it's like, you know, it's this thing in the same way that we talk about like Newgrange being like the winter solstice, or we talk about other sites being on the equinoxes or anything like that, you know. But so Collins was trying to do these calculations himself, and I think he became quite frustrated. He couldn't really get his head around how to actually do the calculations properly. So I wrote a letter to this guy, Alexander Thom, who was very famous archaeoastronomer, an archaeologist astronomer, who was very famous in the 70s and 80s. You were saying, Brian, that you remember.
I met him about 100 yards from this in Fountain Street. That was about 1970, 74, 75, when the Fountain Estate was being demolished and rebuilt. So literally 100 meters from this art gallery.
Yeah, so I was reading this correspondence. They started talking about different parts of the site. They just kept mentioning like the dragon's teeth, which is also referred to as Circle E on the site. Each of the rings or the circles have a letter associated with them. But some of them have nicknames. The dragon's teeth is a nickname for this one circle. It's a circle, but it's all infilled. It's unlike other stone circles where it's just a ring on the outside. This circle is a stone circle, but it also is infilled with lots of tiny little small stones, and it was given the nicknames the dragon's teeth
by local people, or
by Andrew May, who was the person who led the first excavation at the site. So I don't know why he gave it that name, but then to me, it naturally gave me associations to these objects.
You told me earlier that there's a kind of a classical Greek connection with the phrase
Yeah,
dragon's teeth.
There is, yeah. So the story of Cadmus, and it's he's a warrior who stole a dragon's tooth, and they sew it in the ground. And when they sew it in the ground, it creates a warrior, and that warrior then fights other warriors, and then they die and they go back into the ground, and then more warriors spring up. So it's like it's in Greek mythology in that kind of way. But again, like all these things to me just started to like fold together associatively into like being a perfect way of using more to talk about something political.
Because in our society, most of the people some of the people in this room anyway, of my age, will know the term dragon's teeth and the totally different local connection during the Troubles.
Yeah, so the object of these things blocking roads and stuff, yeah. Or like, but people also talk a lot about, I think it's a very popular phrase, like sowing dragon's teeth, this idea of like creating tensions or a way of talking about revenge in some kind of ways. But anyway, all these things, sort of, all these meanings, like signifiers, or you sort of combine in a way where you can use archaeology to talk about like the recent history in a way. In this room in particular, that's what's going on. It's like this fictional conversation between Archie Tom, who is Alexander Tom's son, who led the survey, and Pat Collins, who you met just across the road. And I had to sort of imagine what these people were like, you know. So I asked you if Pat Collins had an English accent, because I assumed he was English from reading his obituary.
I remember that,
yeah. But I couldn't really tell, you know, so I just sort of made it up. But
the title of your exhibition is very provocative. All I see is the present. Go on, tease that out a bit.
So that's the last line that happens in this piece that Pat Collins says is all I see is the present. So I guess it came out of the experience of like being on an archaeological dig. So in Gallery 2, I bought a series of photographs I made while volunteering on an archaeological dig in Kerry, which is where I live now. It's a site called Knocknacuig, which is just outside Tralee. And it's primarily an Iron Age site. The lead archaeologist is a man called Michael Connolly, and he's been leading that dig for the past 3 years now. He's like the county archaeologist for Kerry, so he's leading that dig. He sort of speculates that it's an inauguration site, so it would have been one of the sites for like the clans of Munster. They would have met there probably during McSawen, and they would have, you know, feasted, probably ritually sacrificed somebody, and then a king would have been crowned, you know. And there are like dead bodies that have been found deposited in the ditches around the mound. And I've been around for the findings of those remains as well. Anyway, I'm going off topic. So you're asking why all I see is the present. I guess it's a weird experience. There's a weird discontinuity that happens. You would know this from being an archaeologist and actually being on digs as well, is that like you're time traveling when you go on a dig. You know, you're trialing, and then you're trialing the surface, and you're going further and further into the ground. And as you're doing that, you're sort of going back in time in a way. And then suddenly, like, you can come across something like a carved piece of wood, like you can see in the picture there, or maybe it's something else like a ring or something that pops out of the ground. And this object that's firmly from the past, it could be 2,000 years old, 3,000 years old, is suddenly in the present again, you know. So I think it's about how these things are both past and present at the same time.
Well, I mean, there's a kind of a paradox about all of that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the reason people like me do archaeology is not so much about the past. It's because the thing is there in front of you in the present. It's because the city walls are there, and outside that city walls is a huge ditch. There's probably millions of archaeological objects, not 30 meters from this gallery, just outside the city walls there. And they're there now in the present. They tell us about the past, but they're part of our present. And there's kind of philosophical duel or debate between them, you know. Yeah. On one level, we're trying to reconstruct what happened and what the past was. Yeah. But in other ways, and possibly more importantly, we're trying to understand what our present is. Why the hell are those things there? Why are there kind of funny rocks that seem to point at the sunrise? You know, they're part of our present as distinct from the present of people that lived 6,000 years ago or whatever the case might be. And that's a kind of a constant paradox that you're playing with all the time, you know. Is archaeology about the past, or is it about the present? In fact, it's about both in many ways.
And I guess, like, you know, standing stones and stuff like that are sort of an interesting thing, because they're constantly just present. You know, they are these things that just like constantly insisting that they're there. you know, and they're not changing, and you know, or like if they are changing, they're changing so slowly that we can never really perceive it. You know, I think that's just really, there's something interesting there. That idea of like what time is, like imagining being a standing stone and like what is time in that instance, you know.
It's a kind of a pity that, you know, the study about Moore hasn't revealed some more concrete evidence of alignments, because almost certainly there is some. But we know now, I mean, we've so much evidence from Ireland of sites aligned and with the solstices, the equinoxes, and so on. So the four main Celtic festivals. But almost certainly some aspect of it, they are sort of machines in some way for communication with whatever is going on in the sky from the point of view of people. It's not the same thing. Can I tell a joke? But the most famous alignment in Ireland is the alignment of Newgrange, the passage of Newgrange in County Meath with the winter solstice, the sunrise on the winter solstice. So, of course, in Ireland, you know, seeing the sun at all is a miracle, you know. But anyway, friends of mine were there at the thing one particular year.
They got the tickets?
Were in. Well, they were archaeologists, so they had a kind of they got a, And anyway, that particular year, the sun did its trick. And my understanding is you're in there in maybe a space, what about less than half this room, and you're in the dark more or less, but you can see the light traveling down, and then this golden light fills the chamber. I think it's for 17 minutes, and then bang, it's gone, and you're bang into the darkness again. Anyway, this friend of mine was there this particular year, and this happened. So bang into the darkness again, and everyone's standing there around, and there's a pregnant pause for a minute, and then somebody starts to clap. And I thought it was hilarious clapping. So I was giving a lecture actually in Ardra in Donegal, and I to relieve the board and teasing up the Irish Neolithic. I told them the story about the people clapping the sun in Newgrange, and somebody in the room said, God, he says, if the sun shone any day in Donegal, we'd clap. So,
but there's an interesting story actually. This is like totally off topic, but I think it's an interesting story. So isn't Michael O'Kelly, he excavated Newgrange, but apparently when he was doing the excavations, like before they'd even uncovered the window box where the light comes in, apparently locals would come up to him and go, oh yeah, it's supposed to be that the light goes into the tomb on Christmas Day. Newgrange had been covered up, like the window box hadn't been seen in 4,000 years or whatever, and people were coming up to him and going, oh, there's, you know, it's supposed to be that like the light comes in there. I just think it's amazing that, you know, through like folklore and retelling stories or whatever, somehow.
And Christmas Day is just a shift from the winter, it's just a Christian, like tomorrow is the summer solstice, but it's celebrated in widely as St. John's Eve, which is what is a Tuesday or Wednesday evening. And where I live, it's still, you know, all the bonfires will be lit for it's just again a shift by 3 or 4 days, like the Christianization of the summer solstice, just as Christmas is the Christianization of the winter solstice. So those kind of survival. I mean, it's hard to believe, but there's a case I knew of here in Derry. There was a woman, some people in the audience might have known a woman called Mabel Colquhoun. Mabel Colquhoun she was the headmistress of, I'm not sure what was it, the Londonderry High School, but a girls' school, anyway, she was the headmistress of that. And but she was also like an amateur archaeologist, but a wonderful amateur archaeologist. And in 1943 or something, somebody should make a television program out of her, because she went everywhere on her bicycle. You see this kind of, you know, this slightly kind of weird woman go around in the show on her bicycle, checking all the ancient monuments. But anyway, she came across this site up in Inishowen, and she collected, it was a ring fort, but she collected the story of it, that in the bank of the ring fort, there was a Dane had been buried, a Dane meaning kind of a Viking, you know. Anyway, that was all. She collected that story and she recorded the monument. And then about the 1960s, so over 25 years later, part of the ring fort was demolished, and out fell a whole collection of Viking silver. Wow. So was that a coincidence? Or did Mabel actually record a tradition that had lasted for 1,000 years in the time of the Vikings? how do we know the answer?
Yeah.
But
That's amazing, though. It's just
yeah,
amazing.
yeah. But it's a bit the same with your
Yeah.
I mean, effectively, the folk tale of the light going into at Christmas Day
Mhm.
was an accurate
Totally accurate.
survival of what we now know scientifically.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, one of the things that slightly may have been but one of the things that I've learned as an archaeologist, but also just as a human being, which fascinates me all the time, is nothing is ever forgotten.
Mhm.
Nature constantly records its own history. You know, our bones record our teeth, of course, are marvelous. You find wonderful things out of teeth. Teeth are one of the greatest finds now you can have in archaeology, because it tells you lots and lots of things about where people were born. You know, the water that they drank as babies gets somewhere or other, you know, fossilized in their teeth. So wonderful things can be told from teeth. And the same is true of nature. Constantly records itself. Nothing basically is ever forgotten.
Yeah.
Oh, we might have to fiddle around with technologies to find out how to unlock that information, but that information is there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I had that experience, and I'm sure you've had that experience on the dig as well. You know, even when you're trialing, and suddenly the trial sort of like wants to follow the contours of where things have been. So like suddenly the trial goes down, and you're realizing that you're following like the contour of where a post hole's been. It's so weird that like the soil literally holds the shape of where something once was. I don't really understand how that. Can you explain how that works? Because that doesn't make sense to me.
No, but you know, why did we do anything? You know, why are my arms like this?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the kind of different approaches to archaeology over time as well, because you mentioned some of the sort of revisionist approaches to archaeology. And whilst the stories have been told from different perspectives, through reflecting this current interests and current approaches of the day that the research is happening, and how that shifts over time as well. So the people telling the stories of the past and how we're looking at it and how that changes. And then your role as an artist to have this fictional conversation. So have you noticed through your research different versions of history of the same sites, or not so much?
Yeah, I think the thing that I just noticed is that, you know, and I guess like this touches again on like all I see as the present, is that people want to, particularly with prehistory where there's no like written record and where there's very little evidence actually to go on. In some ways, there's a lot of like inference you have to make about how society was organized and how people lived and all this sort of stuff, that it's quite open, and that lends itself quite nicely to like a wide range of interpretations. So I think depending on what the particular ideology or like goals of that person is, they'll want to say that like that society was egalitarian or hierarchical, and that those things change radically depending on what the impetus of the day is. And I think there was a really interesting documentary that came out like maybe 3 years ago. It was on the BBC, and it was talking about the different approaches to archaeology between Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland, and how that, like, with the formations of those two states, how archaeology of prehistory, particularly Neolithic archaeology, was being used to tell these sites that were often, you know, obviously very interlinked and built by communities that probably were exchanging with one another, were being used to tell different stories, so that like the court tombs that you find a lot in Northern Ireland would have a relationship with like architecturally with tombs that are in Scotland. So that was reinforcing this idea of like the plantation, and that there was always this back and forth going on. Then in the south you had this guy called, I think he was called Rudolph.
No, Rory de Valera.
It was really down there, but in the National Museum there was a guy who was German.
Oh yeah,
You know,
Adolf Marr.
Yeah. And he was Nazi.
They were Nazi. He was the chief Nazi of Ireland, and he was director of the National Museum of Ireland for about 10 years.
So he was really interested in like the idea of like the Aryan race, and he was basically putting forward this case that like the settlers that came to Ireland and built these tombs were like the original Aryan. So there's like this white supremacist sort of undertone to like a lot of the stuff that he was doing for the state at that time. So and there was all tying, and the state were quite happy to adopt that as well, in a sense, because it was a way of saying, like, look, this is like, you know, it's a way of reinforcing this idea of like the Irish person and nationhood and all this sort of stuff.
There was a lot of ideology from the partition, and there was a lot of ideology and archaeology in Ireland. Now, having said that, archaeology in Ireland was almost always organised in a kind of a unified way, so that, for instance, archaeologists from Belfast would be on all the different boards in Dublin, and vice versa. And then when it became, if you like, professionalised, when the profession was set up, if you like, it was the one profession, then people moved backwards and forwards. But there was, from the beginning, there were kind of ideological differences, and they did use, as you say, the prehistoric. And there was an argument went on, a ridiculous argument in retrospect. Did the Belfast archaeologists, the northern archaeologists, if you like, said that Ireland was colonised from Scotland, you see? But the Dublin archaeologists, or the southern archaeologists, argued, no, it was colonised from Spain and France up the Atlantic. Yeah. And I mean, this was just a clash of ridiculous ideologies. In fact, they were colonizing from everywhere, but the ideology. And the other interesting thing, just on that topic, is that after partition, the Belfast, what I might call the Belfast archaeologists, they were based around Queens and what I can't remember what the name you gave to the Monuments Department in Belfast, Pat Collins and people like that came out. But they tended to revert to the prehistoric. Whereas the Dublin archaeologists, one of the leading members of was Rory de Valera, who was the son of Eamon de Valera, the great nationalist leader. But they tended to emphasize the early medieval, the early Christian. This is the glorious age of Ireland. They made all the great chalices and all this kind of thing. So, those, as the Northerners, again, ideology. If you like, prehistory wasn't dangerous because you didn't know what the people thought. Yeah. Whereas once you were in the medieval, we knew what they thought, we knew what language they spoke, and all the rest. So again, there was now all of that survived from 1920, 1930s up to about 1960, and then it began to break down. Of course, there wouldn't be any such thing anymore, but it did. It did influence the way archaeology was organised, the sort of research that went on, and all that kind of thing, for about 30, 40 years. But I'd say it's well gone now,
But it's interesting, yeah. And those interpretations, how we interpret these archaeological sites is like constantly shifting and changing, and probably will continue to shift and change.
Yeah. But interpretation, I think you put your finger on the word interpretation, because it's all about interpretation and all kinds of different people having different. It's not quite the same story, but I tell a story about him in particularly post-medieval Ireland, 17th century onwards. Pilgrimage became quite an organised thing. There were pilgrimages much earlier, but they became kind of semi-organised around. So I'm particularly interested in one down in southwest Donegal, a place called Loper's Point. And there was a pilgrimage. In other words, there was a journey. People made a journey of maybe 5 to 10 kilometers or something. And at various points along this journey, there'd be what they call stations. And a station might be a rag bush, a thorn bush. It might be an ancient prehistoric monument. It might be a cross slab. All sorts of things as were incorporated in this. But anyway, by the way, the clergy, Catholic clergy in particular, stamped them out in the 19th century. But because also the pagan activity went on, drinking and courting and all that I don't need. Anyway, this particular one was in South Donegal, was in honour of a saint called Connell Cael. Now, Connell Cael may have existed or not. And there's also the pagan elements to them but anyway, this pilgrimage was, and there were several of the stations were stone slabs, some of them with crosses on them, but the clergy then stamped the whole thing out, stopped it, and anyway, they fell into disuse. And one of these slabs, about the same, maybe a bit bigger than the table there, one of these slabs, nobody knew what it was for or whatever the tradition of it. And they took it in and used it as a slabstone on the floor, of a house. And there were 2 old bachelors living in this house. and they weren't particularly clean. You know, they were two Irish bachelors. But one of them eventually got married. And the new wife, comes into the house. And one of the first things she does is she washes the floor. And as she washes the floor, lo and behold, doesn't a miracle occur and a cross is revealed? Lord. And people are coming for busloads for the cure, you know, for everything. So that's interpretation, if you like, you know.
And that is where the main conversation between Christopher Steenson and Brian Lacey finished, and we invited questions from the audience. In the following audio, you can hear answers to some of the questions, including standing stones, who protects them and who's responsible for them, the role of drawing in archaeology, and Greenan, how authentic and ancient is it? And I'm afraid the question about metal detectors and how legal they are and the differences north and south gave an answer that was just for the live audience. So we'll leave that to your imagination. Okay, let's get back to the speakers.
Yeah, by the way, I should say that with some of the difference north and south, by and large, the legislation in the north and the south have always kept pace with it. Basically, the same laws, and they're very different to the laws in Britain. For instance, metal detecting is fairly common in Britain and is quite legal. Metal detecting is utterly illegal in the Republic. Well, not the act itself, but certainly if you dig anything, you know, as a rule, or theoretically, a metal detector is a radio transmitting and receiving device, and you should have a radio transmitting and receiving license now. Anyway, I just thought that the laws north and south of the border tend to be the same. You know, if some amendment is made in the south, and a few years later it'll kind of catch up in the north, and vice versa. So we have laws here that are different to Britain. That's archaeological laws. Basically, on the island of Ireland, every archaeological site is protected and should not, you know, it is a breach of the law to interfere with it in any way, unless you have a license. Now, I'm sort of an archaeologist, I'm retired now, but to be a practicing archaeologist in Ireland and to work at a site, you need basically two licenses. You have to have a general license, which is a bit like a driving license, and you have to pass a test, you know, to get that license. And then when you have that, if you have that license, then you can apply for a particular license for a particular site. So even if that site's in your own back garden, in theory, you can't interfere with it or excavate it without an excavation license, you know. So everything is comprehensively protected. And then some sites that are of more importance are deemed to be so-called, the north are the historic monuments in the north, and there are national monuments in the south.
Is it? Yeah.
But whatever, I'm not sure exactly. But anyway, they have more or less, they have some sort of special legal status. But whether a site has that status or doesn't is irrelevant, ultimately. The detectors will find something, okay? You know, people think that archaeologists want to find an object, but that's not the purpose of archaeology. Archaeology is about finding information, about knowledge. And if you dig, you know, if you find a bronze arrowhead in the ground and dig it up, you've destroyed the context. And it's the context that will tell us the date of the thing and everything like that.
I think there's also, I don't know how accurate this is, but there's different rules around like how resources work in Ireland in terms of like if you struck gold or something, the state owns that, you know, and like the idea of what treasure is then also applies to that to a certain extent as well. But yeah, context is also obviously an important thing there as well. Like you're destroying any dating information. You could find a bronze axe head, but if you don't have like the context of like where that layer is or like attachment information around that with certain pieces of like carbon or wood to then date to like figure out whether that's from that period or not, it's useless.
The classic example is, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Broiter Hoard. Anyone of the Broiter Hoard collection of gold objects, wonderful gold objects, which was found in near Limerick on the shores of Lough Foyle. About 1890 was found. Anyway, the finder sold it to an antique dealer from Cork, I think it was, who in turn, who knew what it was, and he sold it to the British Museum, and it went on display. And then all hell broke loose because it was an Iron Age collection, you see. And of course, Ireland was part of the UK at the time. So UK law applied, and it was treasure trove law. The UK still has treasure trove. We've removed it in the Republic. I'm 2,000 years ago, and I have a bag of gold coins in my hand, and I'm running from an enemy or something, and I drop the bag of gold coins, and then the enemy overtakes and kills me. And some 2,000 years ago, somebody finds the gold. That's not treasure trove, okay? If, on the other hand, I'm the same individual 2,000 years ago with my bag of gold, and I'm running away from my enemies, and I deliberately hide the bag of gold, but they kill me again, and then 2,000 years, that is treasure trove. So the intention has to be to deliberately hide it, but the state then takes possession of it. Because it's treasure trove. The theory is a legal fiction. In case I ever come back to reclaim it, you see, the state are going to kind of keep an eye on that for me. But the right of word was eventually they had to go to court over whether it was or wasn't treasure trove. And it was hilarious because the only evidence, back to Europe, the only evidence they could give in the court was about gods and, that it was a vote of offering. The Celtic sea god Manannán Mac Lir lives in Loch Foy. So that this was a vote of offering. Now, if it was a vote of offering, it wasn't hidden, it was deliberately given to the god. So that would not be treasure trove. Not treasure trove. It had to be lost to be treasure trove. Sorry, it had to be hidden to be treasure trove. If it was been given to the god, it wasn't true. Anyway, that argument to some extent still goes on. Eventually, the state acquired, the UK state acquired ownership of the gold in the legal fiction of the time. Queen Victoria acquired it, and she donated it to the National Museum in Dublin, and it's still there. But in the meantime, archaeology has proceeded, and we now know that, in fact, really, it should be given back to the UK. I don't see that will never. But really, it should be on a museum in Limavady or something.
Yeah, I think it's really odd. Like, I mean, a perfect example is the artifacts that are in the vitrine right beside you, which I don't think I've been seen by human eyes outside of like the people that own them in the National Museum's collection, probably since they were excavated. I don't think they've ever been on display. I've never seen any photographs of them. The only things that I've been able to find are drawings from the original papers that were published about being more in the 1950s or 60s or whatever that was, or maybe a little bit earlier. So it's sort of crazy that we collect all these things and they're just like hidden away. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be collected, that they should be preserved and studied, I think, but like, maybe this is another point altogether that I'm making, but I just wish that things were just shared more and that there was more access to these things, that they're as protected and controlled as they are.
In the past, I'm really talking about Ireland now, but I suspect this is the same true in other, places like Italy and Greece that would have, fabulous art. But in Ireland anyway, most of these things, particularly monuments as distinct from artifacts, would have been protected by folklore. And by superstition, if you like, you didn't go near that fairy circle, or you didn't touch that stone, or whatever the case may be. There's a stone, I'm not very far from my house in the West Donegal now, and the people just paint it white every year for May Day. Now, I don't think the people themselves know why they do that, but they do that. The stone was erected maybe 4,000 years ago, and there they are still going. So, with those kind of traditions and folklore, obviously, is dying off, hopefully replaced by education of people. But there's not much education. There's very little about this sort of stuff in the school's curriculum. I think north and south, kids are not told about these sort of things at all. I'm always impressed by the degree to which people still respect these things. I was saying earlier, we found a new megalithic tomb of about 6,000 years, 4,000 BC roughly, last Friday, AS2. Now, how it was missed, I don't know. Missed by archaeologists. Of course, local people do it. I mean, it's like, Americans founded by Columbus, Nobody, I'm the same. I found a new monument last Friday. Of course, the people already knew it was there and had respected and preserved it and wouldn't touch it. That's the point. Yeah. But hopefully you'd like to think that education, the sort of information technology available, that will help to preserve these things. Oh, sure, but lost all the time. We know, I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever, particularly carvings. And if you go back to art, an awful lot of the monuments that are stone carving is the
rock art and stuff like that.
Yeah, and they're the Christian early medieval. I mean, they're being destroyed all the time by frost and acid rain. In the last 100 years, they've deteriorated more than they deteriorated in the previous 1,000 years. We know that.
But I cannot draw, as you know. But I think I was offered as the artist on the dig. I was asked if I wanted to do some of the drawings, and I declined. Said no, I would leave them to that. But taking photographs, it was like a tricky situation. Actually, I found just respecting the dig, and it's an ongoing dig. It's starting up again in a week's time with the dig in there. They've been doing it in the past few summers. So I think there's a lot of tension around drawing too much attention to it, and the idea, or I think particularly in the modern sort of time of being able to share images instantly, the idea of taking a picture of something and then sharing it online on your Instagram feed is an archaeologist's worst nightmare when it digs in progress, because the idea that there's a trench that's in progress and there could still be objects just below the surface that could be easily accessed and taken away or looted or whatever is a concern. So I think there was a lot of worries there around that. But once I explained that I was taking things on my film camera and it would take probably a month to get something developed, so even I wouldn't be able to see the images, I think that was a way of satisfying their fears around all of that, slightly anyway.
Well, modern technology again has given us miraculous kind of things. I mean, LiDAR and these kinds of things that can image from the sky a hill for something, and can at the push of a button you can remove all the vegetation and things like that. But anyway, we didn't have anything like that. My first book was The Archaeological Survey of Donegal, was published in 1983. And of course, there's lots and lots of the drawings by other people, not by me. But I decided I would have to make at least one drawing in it. And I thought, well, I'll make a map of Ireland. It's the Archaeological Survey of Donegal. So I'll draw a map of Ireland and I'll black out, as it were, Donegal. But even that I made a book. So, but an interesting thing happened about 2 years ago now. I'm sorry. Something you will know about Ogham or Ogham, which is the oldest form of writing we have from Ireland. It's a bit like Morse code. It's the Latin alphabet, but represented by sort of lines and dots and things. Anyway, there's none in Donegal. Most of it is down in the southwest, But there's one, I think, in County Derry. There's one example in County Tyrone. There's one in Sligo, but there were none in Donegal until 2 years ago, when one was found. Anyway, it has the word written on it. It's not very like graveyard memorials, Usually they're genealogy, Johnson of Jackson of whatever, James is buried here, is basically what they usually say. But this one doesn't. It has the word Quaridas, which is Qaridas. Now, what's that? So when I saw it first, I thought it was the word Cargus in Irish, which would mean friendship or love or loving or some those kind of elements. Or the Latin word, in fact, it's related to the Latin word caritas, charity, love, again, all these kinds of things. But anyway, the experts now tell us that it's not. It's the word crida, Coire, which is a cauldron. So it's some sort of ritualistic thing, you see. But anyway, the embarrassing thing was that this is only discovered 2 years ago. But 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, the stone itself was recorded. And who recorded it? Only me. And in the records, in the archives, there's a perfect description of this thing. And to go back to a lovely little drawing, a perfect measured technical drawing of the stone, but not a hint about the Ogham on it. And now, in my defense, at the time it was in a ditch and it was covered in moss. Since then, a new farmer has taken over the land and he re-erected it and cleaned it, and the Ogham has been revealed in it. But it's one of the few drawings I ever made, actually. And it's a total embarrassment to me now, because it doesn't stop. It's the most important thing. I think it's quite genuine. I would accept. Now, we know it was reconstructed by a doctor from Derry here in 1879 or something. But in 1835, quite a detailed survey was made of the Ordnance Survey, and we have those drawings. And so we know what it looked like. Now, it was largely collapsed, but substantial portions of it were still. So we have those drawings. So I believe it. I've written that book there. It only came out last year, but I argue about it. I believe it was built that, the stone fortress is only one element. There's a whole collection of monuments there, but the stone fortress obviously is the main thing. I believe it was built about 800 AD, and that it's basically a Donegal man's version of the Colosseum in Rome. That's my interpretation of it. The king who built it, I'm arguing this, was a king called Ingor. His father was king before him. He booted his father out, kicked him out, and took his place. And he sent the father off on a pilgrimage to Rome. And I think the father came back with stories about Rome, and the thing is that the king's name is Aid Ingor, but he has another nickname. He's called Aid Ornage, Aid the Ordained. Now, what's that all about? The ordained business. But he becomes king of Donegal, and then ultimately of West Ulster, and ultimately king of Tara, the most important kingship in Ireland. And anyway, in the year 800, he becomes king in 804, king of Tara, the main kingship in Ireland. But in 800 AD, on Christmas Day, 800 AD, the Emperor Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor. And I think Aidingor is imitating him. He sees his place in the hierarchy of European Christendom. And so the emperor is above him, ordained by the Pope, and he's King of Ireland. That's how he would have. He wasn't King of Ireland, but he claimed to be King of Ireland. And I think he surrounds himself then with all this kind of Roman regalia, and which I think the agreed on is. I think it's very genuine. By the way, Dr. Bernard was the name of the man that rebuilt it from Derry. And he marked, I think I used to be able to see it, but I don't know if I can see it anymore. He marked in tar the difference between what was original, what he found, to what he rebuilt. And I think I used to be able to see that, like there was a line, it was very deteriorated by the time, but he did do it. But no, I would happily accept it. Now, whether it's exactly what was there in the 9th century, I don't know. But I think it's largely, I'd be very happy to accept it.
And just to let you know that one of our previous roundtable podcasts from last year, it's actually roundtable number 11, included Marie Farrington, Megan Marcedo, and Roisin O'Mara. And Roisin's actually an archaeological artifact illustrator and artist. So that's something that you can listen to hear more about sort of the artist's approach to memory and time. And that's where we leave our live in conversation with Christopher Steenson and Brian Lacey. You can find out more about the project at ccadld.org online or at ccadld on the socials. And a final thank you to our speakers and to our funders, to our live audience, and thank you for listening.